Get ready to hear some knowledge of the ancients this week on History Calling as I look at the history of the flat earth myth. I'll be asking, did Europeans in the past really think that the earth was flat? Or have many, and now most human beings, accepted that the world is round for millennia, even before Christopher Columbus famously sailed to North America in 1492 and didn't fall off the edge of the planet? I'll share quotes from classical and medieval writers with you and look at some very old maps, globes, coins and paintings to demonstrate what they thought about the shape of our home and how they reached their conclusions. I'll also explain where and why the popular notion that our medieval ancestors thought the world was flat originated. And spoiler alert, it's a much more recent idea than you might think, and has a lot to do with the guy who wrote Sleepy Hollow. Cruise around the internet for a few minutes looking up what medieval people thought of the shape of the world, and you'll soon stumble across quotes like these, perpetuating the misnomer that most Europeans thought it was flat until Columbus discovered America. I even came across this children's rhyme, which I'd never heard before, but that might be because we didn't do Spanish or American history in my primary school. It reads, "In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He took 3 ships with him too, and called aboard his faithful crew. Mighty strong and brave was he, as he sailed across the open sea." Some people still thought the world was flat. Can you even imagine that? Okay, now this poem isn't entirely wrong. Some people did still think the world was flat, as do some people today, but it's insinuating that this was a commonly held belief. In actual fact, the idea that those living in Europe before the mid-1490s mostly thought the world was a disc isn't generally true. The belief, based on observable phenomena that it is spherical, has been around for millennia, and plenty of people living in both the ancient and medieval periods knew and accepted this theory. I can't list all the evidence here for you for reasons of time, but I'll give you a few examples which cover over 1,000 years of history to make my point, and show you how people of the past worked out the shape of the world long before the dawn of the space age. Aristotle noted in his work about the heavens, written in around 350 BC, that there was some dispute about whether the planet was round or flat, but pointed out that the Earth must be spherical because how else would eclipses of the moon show segments shaped as we see them? As it is, the shapes which the moon itself each month shows are of every kind, straight, gibbous and concave, but in eclipses the outline is always curved, and since it is the interposition of the Earth that makes the eclipse, the form of this line will be caused by the form of the Earth's surface, which is therefore spherical. Again, our observations of the stars make it evident not only that the Earth is circular, but also that it is a circle of no great size, for quite a small change of position to south or north causes a manifest alteration of the horizon. There is much change, in the stars which are overhead, and the stars seen are different as one moves northward or southward. Another big leap forward came when the Greek polymath Eratosthenes, who lived between about 276 and 194 BC, calculated the circumference of the Earth to a surprisingly accurate degree. As if that wasn't clever enough, he was also able to produce this map of the known world, which is unexpectedly good when you consider when it was created. You can clearly see the shape of Western Europe, including the boot of Italy and the presence of Britain and Ireland. By the start of the 1st century AD, the Greek author Strabo, who was born in modern-day Turkey and died in about the year 23, was recording that knowledge of the Earth's shape was now commonplace amongst the educated, saying, "Now what we are taught by the physicists is as follows. The universe and the heavens are sphere-shaped. The tendency of the bodies that have weight is towards the centre, and having taken its position about this centre in the form of a sphere, the Earth remains homocentric with the heavens." Later in the century, in around AD 77, the Roman writer Pliny the Elder said in his work entitled Natural History, "We all agree on the earth's shape, for surely we always speak of the round ball of the earth." He also noted that the ability to see less of large objects from further away and more of them as one gets close, which proved and still proves the earth's curvature, saying that this explains why the land is not visible from the deck of a ship when in sight from the masthead, and why, as a vessel passes far into the distance, if some shining object is tied to the top of the mast, it appears slowly to sink and finally it is hidden from sight. This sentiment was echoed in the 2nd century by Claudius Ptolemy, who came from the Egyptian city of Alexandria, though his name suggests Greek descent. He wrote in his Almagest that whenever we sail towards mountains or any high places, from whatever angle, in whatever direction, we see their bulk little by little increasing, as if they were arising from the sea, whereas before they seemed submerged because of the curvature of the water's surface. In all cases, these men were correct, and their observations of lunar eclipses, stars, boats, and mountains may still be made today. They didn't need fancy modern technology to work out that the earth is round. They simply opened their eyes, took a look around, applied the most basic tenets of common sense and logic, and boom. They figured out thousands of years ago what some twits with access to high-res photographs and footage of the planet taken from outer space still can't get their little brains around today. What's more, their ideas stuck and were widely accepted by scholars in later centuries and millennia, long before the technological advancements of the modern era. The English monk, known as the Venerable Bede, said in the 720s, so about 6 centuries after Ptolemy lived, that the reason why the same days are of unequal length is the roundness of the earth, for not without reason it is called the orb of the world on the pages of Holy Scripture and of ordinary literature. It is, in fact, a sphere set in the middle of the whole universe. It is not merely circular like a shield or spread out like a wheel, but resembles more a ball, being equally round in all directions. Now, I know Bede and these other authors weren't 100% on the money. We're not in the middle of the universe, and the planet isn't a perfect sphere. It has an equatorial bulge, for instance, but he and they had mastered the basics. These round earth views continued throughout the medieval period in both religious and secular texts. English philosopher and Franciscan friar Roger Bacon wrote as much in his Opus Maius in around 1270, as did Pierre Daly, Archbishop of Cambrai, in his Imago Mundi, written in 1410. In the Divine Comedy, written by Italian writer Dante in the early 1300s, we likewise find the world described as a sphere on more than one occasion, while back over in England, later in the 14th century, Geoffrey Chaucer included the line, "This wide world which that men see is round," in his story The Franklin's Tale. There were many others, too numerous to list here, but I think I've made my point. Knowledge of the Earth's spherical nature was widespread and being constantly reinforced by the written word. But what about all those people who couldn't read, I hear you say? How were they supposed to know the Earth was round? Well, even assuming they didn't just figure it out for themselves by looking at the masts of ships in the distance, as the ancients had done, they had other options too. The roundness of the planet was also depicted in globes long before Columbus's famous voyage. To return to Strabo for a moment, he wrote that, "We have now traced on a spherical surface the area in which we say the inhabited world is situated, and the man who would most closely approximate the truth by constructed figures must needs take for the earth a globe like that of Crates." Crates, for context, was Crates of Malos, who lived in the 2nd century BC. There is also a globe still in existence today known as the Erdapfel, it means earth apple, which was created between 1491 and 1492 in Nuremberg. This was made before Columbus returned from America and shows nothing but ocean where the North and South American continents are. Then we have the evidence of paintings in which we can see images of Christ and medieval monarchs holding orbs to represent the earth. Here's one of Richard II of England, for instance, painted in the 1390s. In other cases, orbs can be seen on coinage. This example is from the 11th century. They also appear in architecture, including church architecture. Here we see a statue of Jesus holding the orb of the world in his hand from Reims Cathedral, built in the 1300s. It is this variety of evidence, written and physical, plus a person's ability to work out the shape of the Earth for themselves by just looking at slowly appearing or disappearing ships on the horizon, which convinces me that the general population of Europe knew the Earth was round during the medieval period. For those of you still holding on to the idea that perhaps the educated classes knew it, but the general population didn't, I would ask you to think about why you're making that assumption. Why would you think that the population at large was being exposed to and believing the theories of a small number of flat earthers over the much vaster quantity of round earth material being pumped out by the church, the state, and writers of the day? It's like saying that most people today must believe in the flat earth myth simply because a small number of conspiracy theorists and pseudoscientists do. They may be divorced from reality, but most of us aren't, and the same was true of our ancestors. So I hope we can agree that people living not just hundreds, but thousands of years ago were able to figure out that the Earth is round using no greater technology than their eyeballs, and that that knowledge still existed and was widely disseminated in the medieval period. Where then does the myth that most believed the world to be flat until the voyage of Columbus come from? Before I answer that, if you're enjoying this content, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on so that YouTube lets you know when I upload fresh content. I've had a few people tell me recently that they thought they were subscribed, only to discover that they appear to have been unsubscribed without their knowledge, so it might be worth double checking your status as well. For more from History Calling, you can also check out my Patreon site, where I share bonus material, including early access to ad-free videos and mini podcasts, and my Amazon storefront, where I've gathered together a lot of history-themed books and gift ideas for you, arranged in idea lists. I'm also on Instagram too, and all of these outlets are linked below for you. Thank you to those of you who already support me through any one of these platforms, and to those of you who make one-off donations to the channel using the thanks button underneath videos. And now, back to the story that medieval Europeans thought the Earth was flat. There are a few reasons for the misconception about the extent of medieval European knowledge, and the first is maps. Ancient and medieval maps, known as mappamundi, literally maps of the world, are regularly misunderstood by modern eyes. They are assumed to be only attempts at representing real geography, as best it was understood in the period in which they were created, because that is how we think of maps today. Therefore, the way in which they were drawn, like this circular representation, has been taken to mean that people literally thought the world was flat. In actual fact, many of them were meant to demonstrate to humans their place in the universe in relation to God in the heavens in a more abstract allegorical sense, though some geographical information could also be present. Here you can see Jesus and angels at the top, for instance, representing heaven, demonic beasts at the bottom representing hell, and Jerusalem at the centre, which was a common feature. As David Woodward, writing in the Cambridge History of Science, says, the purpose of the Mappamundi was to help the faithful navigate the spiritual and historical rather than the physical world. Thus, for instance, you can see so-called T in O maps, so named because they look like a capital T in the middle of a circle. The T resembled a cross, and some maps even have Christ superimposed on top of them in the crucifixion pose, while the circle was the world. As Woodward explains, albeit in a different publication, the threefold division of the world in the TO maps represents the peopling of the earth in the three continents by each of Noah's sons. The families of Shem, the eldest son, have the maximum share, or Asia, in the tripartite scheme. Ham, Africa, and Japheth, Europe, are often depicted or listed on these maps. So the layout of these maps doesn't mean people literally thought this was the shape of the world or the continents. They knew it wasn't. I've already shown you very early maps of the known world which actually attempted to show its geography. And of course, people could just look at the shapes of their shorelines, the mountains near their homes, and the islands and lakes they knew existed, and understand that T&O maps weren't meant to be factual. Furthermore, even when early maps were meant to show real geography, the shape in which the land and water were laid out does not indicate what shape the authors thought the world actually was. Nowadays, we usually see 2D maps drawn out in a rectangular shape, but we don't think the Earth is a big flat rectangle, or at least most of us don't. It's just a cartographical convention. The second reason some people think that medieval Europeans believed the world was flat is that just like today, while the Earth's spherical shape was widely accepted, there were a few outliers who claimed it was a disc. Aristotle tells us about some of those who had come before him during the 6th, 5th and 4th centuries BC, saying, Anaximenes and Anaxagoras and Democritus, no idea if I pronounced those correctly, give the flatness of the earth as the cause of its staying still. Thus, they say, it does not cut, but covers like a lid the air beneath it. Of course, as we've seen, he went on to demolish their arguments, though unfortunately none of Anaximenes and Democritus's work survives for me to quote to you, and only fragments of Anaxagoras's does. We only know about them for the most part through mentions of them in later works like those of Aristotle. Later on, some Christian writers struggled to reconcile the spherical nature of the world with how it is described in the Bible, which includes descriptions of it having 4 corners. Instead of just accepting this language as being poetical and allegorical, or a reference to the 4 compass points, north, south, east and west, they tried to make it literal, arguing that this was divine evidence of a flat earth. One such man was Severianus, Bishop of Gabala, who lived in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. Another was the 6th century Byzantine Cosmas Indicopleustes. Then there was Lactantius, who lived during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD and was an advisor to the Roman Emperor Constantine. With little understanding of gravity, he struggled to see how people living elsewhere on a sphere could avoid falling off, and wrote, Is anyone so foolish as to believe that there are men whose feet are higher than their heads, trees growing downwards, rain, snow, and hail falling upwards? This craziness, he said, was the result of the daft notion that the earth was round. The thing is, while these voices existed, as we've already seen, they were in the minority as long ago as the start of the 1st millennium AD. Magnifying them to make it appear that they represented commonly held beliefs in their times completely distorts the historical record and should be avoided. They were a fringe group, just like flat earthers are today. As Woodward says, these views were anomalous. Cosmas was the object of contemporary ridicule, whereas the 1st to 4th century views of the Earth's sphericity were far more representative of the period. The third reason for the false perception that medieval Europeans believed in a flat Earth is the persistent belief that its church leaders taught them so, and that the Catholic Church was in opposition to all science and reason and was spreading ignorance to its followers regarding this issue. This is patently false. While there were certainly instances when medieval and early modern churchmen refused to bend to new scientific knowledge, Google the problems Galileo had with them for an example, this isn't one of them. As I've explained, just like today, there were a few particularly stupid extremists who refused to accept the mountain of evidence right in front of their eyes and who insisted that the world was flat. But this was not church doctrine. Far from it. In fact, numerous churchmen spoke and wrote about a round earth, including the aforementioned Roger Bacon and Cardinal Pierre Daly. I've also shown you medieval religious paintings showing the earth as an orb and pointed out that coins and 13th century church architecture, which could be viewed by the masses, did the same. This pseudo-history slander against the intelligence of those running the medieval Catholic Church and the continent's population in general was invented in the 19th and early 20th centuries by a series of secular and Protestant writers. These men disliked religion, or at the very least Catholicism, and wanted to attack the Church by making it seem as though it was dangerous and backward and had long sought to stunt intellectual advancements and keep the world in ignorance. But who were they? One influential contributor to this myth was the American writer Washington Irving. In his heavily fictionalized 1828 book, History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, he provided a much embellished account of a meeting of church and university men held at Salamanca in 1491 before Columbus set off on the famous voyage which led to his discovery of America. Irving presented many of the assembled churchmen as morons, saying, "All subjects were still contemplated through the obscure medium of those ages when the lights of antiquity were trampled out, and faith was left to fill the place of inquiry. Bewildered in a maze of religious controversy, mankind had retraced their steps and receded from the boundary line of ancient knowledge." He went on to say that writers like Lactantius were considered in those days as almost an evangelical authority, which is not true, and quoted Lactantius's flat earth theory. He did acknowledge that some present at the Council of Salamanca admitted to the globular nature of the earth, but insinuated that Columbus was nevertheless so unusual in stating this that, quote, he was in danger of being convicted, not merely of error, but of heterodoxy. This is already rather contradictory, and it only gets worse when he implies that Columbus was trying to convince the assembled scholars of the sphericity of the earth, which he wasn't. As I've already demonstrated, its shape was widely known about, accepted, and disseminated by the church at this point through writings, artwork, and architecture. Of much greater interest to contemporaries was the size of the world, and whether it was feasible to circumnavigate it. Irving then backtracks a bit more, saying that the flat earth theory and other ideas about whether humans could live in other parts of the globe were probably advanced by but few, and those persons immersed in theological studies in cloistered retirement, where the erroneous opinions derived from books had little opportunity of being corrected by the experience of the day. He can't seem to make up his mind about just how insulting he'd like to be to the Catholic Church, perhaps because he knew his audience were aware that their medieval ancestors knew the earth was round and weren't going to buy into the idea that most people didn't already possess this information by the 1490s. Nevertheless, the falsehood he created of a regressive institution still clinging to the idea of a flat earth took hold, and was soon being further promoted by others. In 1834, the anti-religious French academic Jean-Antoine Latron published a widely disseminated book called On the Cosmographical Ideas of the Church Fathers, which further pushed the claims that the medieval church and its followers thought the earth was flat. Next came the likes of the Anglican William Whewell in 1837, who wrote a book called History of the Inductive Sciences. He claimed that for much of its history, the Catholic Church had neglected and even discommended the study of natural philosophy, and, quote, made inquiries of mere curiosity seem to be a reprehensible misapplication of human powers. This led them to be unable to make reasoned conclusions or accept the reasoned conclusions of others. He then went on to say that they denied the roundness of the earth because they followed the writings of Lactantius and Cosmas, totally omitting the fact that they were in the minority in their views of a flat earth and were even ridiculed for them. Other 19th and early 20th century writers made similar assertions, and from there it was a slippery slope into these ideas, making it into school textbooks and the public consciousness. The Children's Encyclopedia of 1910, for instance, which you see a little excerpt of here, confidently asserted that it was only when some brave sailors made it to America that the myth of the flat earth was finally put to bed. So ironically, it's not the medieval Catholic Church, or indeed any Christian church that I'm aware of, which tried to suppress facts regarding who knew the earth was round and when. It was later men, claiming to be reputable historians and scientists, but motivated by a vendetta either against religion in general or sometimes just Catholicism, who invented the lie that this knowledge had been all but lost during the medieval period, and who so quickly and efficiently spread it that this ignorance persists to this day in many quarters. And there you have it. That's the history of the flat earth myth from ancient times to the 20th century. I imagine some of you want to know why I think people in the 21st century still believe this preposterous lie, which was so thoroughly debunked over 2,000 years ago, But as this is a history channel, I deliberately avoided getting too much into this question, as modern social studies aren't my thing. My answer, however, if you want it, is that there are a lot of very daft people in the world who lack even basic critical reasoning skills, and some of them become flat earthers. I don't feel the need to think about them any further than that. I've also avoided getting into a discussion of how we can prove the Earth is round, except for explaining how the ancients did it and mentioning the existence of photos of the planet taken from outer space, because that would be a whole other video, and again, not really historical. However, I'll leave a link below to a video by a scientist who has much greater patience than I would have for this, which explains some of the other reasons. As for how we can combat lies and misinformation like this, I think we have to keep calling it out for what it is and stomping on it using real science and historical sources to prove what is truth and what isn't. If you'd like some more ancient history, try this video next on the Library of Alexandria. Or for another example of a myth perpetuated for centuries by maps, liars, and some genuine errors, watch this one on the fabled island of Hy-Brasil. I'll be back next week with something new, and until then, keep learning.